Every day, thousands of people pass through a place in London called Blackfriars. Most never stop to ask why it's called that, but this wasn't just a name, it was once a walled precinct in the center of the city where the laws of London did not apply, a place where Parliament met, where kings held court, and where one of the most powerful institutions in medieval England operated quietly behind its own walls, a city within a city, and today, almost nothing of it remains except the name. To understand what Blackfriars really was, you have to go back to the early 1200s, when a group known as the Dominican Order arrived in England. They weren't like the monks who lived out in the countryside. These men moved directly into cities. They preached in the streets, they taught in universities, and they positioned themselves at the center of political life. And within a few decades, they would establish one of the most powerful urban enclaves in the country, right here along the River Thames. But the real power of the Blackfriars wasn't just in its buildings, it was in something far more unusual, something that allowed it to operate completely outside the authority of the City of London. And once you understand that, the entire role of Blackfriars begins to change. In 1276, King Edward I granted the Dominicans a large tract of land between Ludgate Hill and the River Thames. This wasn't a small monastery, it was a massive complex covering several acres in one of the most valuable locations in London. The friars were even given permission to break through the old city wall to expand their grounds, and what they built there would become one of the largest religious precincts in England. But the size of the land wasn't the most important part. The real significance of Blackfriars was legal, because this entire area was designated as something known as a liberty. A liberty was a zone that operated outside the control of the City of London. The Lord Mayor had no authority there. City laws didn't apply. Guild restrictions couldn't reach inside. Within those walls, the Blackfriars governed themselves, which meant that right in the middle of London, there existed a separate jurisdiction, a place with its own rules, its own protections, and its own power, a city within a city. And to understand how unusual this was, you have to picture what London was like at the time. The city was tightly controlled, trade was regulated by guilds, movement was monitored, and most people lived under strict layers of authority. But inside Blackfriars, those rules didn't apply. People could live and work there without being subject to the same restrictions. Merchants could operate more freely. Outsiders could find a place within its walls. And for anyone looking to move beyond the limits of the city, this made Blackfriars a very different kind of space, not just religious, but strategic. And this is where it gets interesting, because this wasn't just an isolated religious community. The Blackfriars precinct became one of the most important political spaces in England. Parliaments were held here, foreign rulers were hosted here, and in 1529, one of the most consequential trials in English history took place within these walls. The divorce hearing of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a moment that would ultimately lead to the break from Rome, was conducted inside Blackfriars, which tells you something important. This wasn't just a monastery, this was a place where national decisions were made. And when you look at the kinds of events that took place here, you begin to see just how central it was. This was not a secondary location. This was where power gathered, where negotiations happened, where outcomes were decided behind closed doors. And because it existed outside the normal authority of the city, it offered something unique, a controlled environment, separate from the pressures of the streets, where high-level decisions could unfold, which is exactly why moments like the 1529 tribunal were held here, not just for space, but for control. But that raises a question. Who exactly were these men who could operate outside the laws of the city and host the most powerful figures in England? The Dominican Order, often called the Blackfriars, was not just another religious group. They were part of an international network with houses across Europe, connected through universities, trade routes, and royal patronage. They weren't isolated, they were deeply embedded in the systems of power. Many of these friaries were located near trade routes, especially along rivers and coastlines. London, Bristol, King's Lynn, Drogheda. These were not random locations, they were some of the busiest commercial entry points in the region, which meant the Blackfriars were positioned at the crossroads of movement, goods, ideas, and people. And this is where things begin to shift. Because when you look at the records from these areas, you start to see something else. The liberties around London, including Blackfriars, were known for attracting people from outside the traditional structure of the city: foreign merchants, sailors, laborers, travelers, people moving through the expanding trade networks of early modern Europe. In parish records and city documents, you find individuals described with terms like Moor, blackamoor, or swarthy. These descriptions appear in scattered entries, small references, but they point to something important. These areas were not isolated, they were connected to a wider world. In the 1530s, King Henry VIII began dismantling the monastic system across England. The same institutions that once held enormous wealth and influence were suddenly stripped of their land, their buildings, and their authority. Blackfriars was no exception. The monastery was dissolved, its assets were seized, its structures were taken apart, stone by stone. But something unusual happened next. Even though the monastery itself was gone, the legal status of the area remained. The liberty of Blackfriars was never fully absorbed into the control of the City of London, which meant the same conditions that once allowed the friars to operate freely still existed. The power structure had changed, but the framework was still there, and that framework would attract a different kind of activity. Without the restrictions of the city, the Blackfriars precinct became a center for entertainment. Playhouses were built, audiences gathered, and eventually, one of the most famous theater companies in history would perform there. The King's Men, the company of William Shakespeare. And maybe that's the most interesting part of all, because even though the buildings are gone and the monastery itself no longer exists, the structure it created never fully disappeared. The idea of a space operating differently from everything around it, a place shaped by power, movement, and influence, that idea remained. And today, the name Blackfriars still marks that location, a quiet reminder of a time when, right in the center of London, there existed something very different, a place that stood apart, a place that operated on its own terms, a city within a city. What you've just seen is not theory, it is the record. The rule of St. Augustine laid the foundation. The libellus of Jordan of Saxony documented the rise. The archives of English heritage preserved the physical footprint, and the records of Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, confirmed their integration into the highest levels of learning in England. These are not later interpretations. These are contemporaneous structures, written, built, and maintained in their own time. And yet, what remains in public memory today, a pub, a ghost story, fragments of folklore, sites like Blackfriar Pub, and legends tied to places like 30 East Drive, echoes of something far more organized, far more powerful, because when institutions fade, they are not always erased. Sometimes they are remembered incorrectly. So the question is no longer whether the Blackfriars existed. The record is clear. The question is, what were they when they held power, and how much of that reality still survives in the archive, waiting to be read?